I know all events from beginning to end. My body stretches out across all time and space. My toes reach back to the beginning of time. My fingers stretch out to the end. My body is covered by a countless number of spheres, strung together and wrapped around me like a rosary. They tangle in my dark hair. Their smooth surfaces caress my bare skin. Each sphere contains a second of time and space. I am wrapped in all of time and space. I am Yog-Sothoth, father and mother to creatures that you cannot even conceive of, ruler of the universe with Azathoth, the idiot god, and believe me, he deserves that title. He couldn't find his own feet with both hands. I suppose I shouldn't hold a grudge. I know what will happen to him. But when one is deprived of the love of one's life, one is bitter for a long time. It's unfortunate to know how happy one can be with someone, and at the same time know how much it will cut to the bone when that love is gone, and still at the same time feel the anger at who is going to take them away from me, and finally the sorrow and the hell that is the end. But none of this has happened for them yet. Perhaps I should tell the story as they saw it happen. Trying to tell it as I see it will only confuse you and cause you to go insane. It's simple, really. Azathoth and I rule everything. He sits at the very center of the universe and sees nothing. I sit outside the universe and see everything. He toys with all manner of creatures in his attempt to gain more power. I do what I can to bring about change and improve what I see in the world, but there is only so much I can do. I'm locked out of the universe, and I am locked out of it for a reason. When I first came into being and was young, Azathoth came to me and asked me one question. Will I be revered by the creatures of the universe, he asked. Yes, I replied without hesitation. Even then, even when I was young, I knew everything. Azathoth went back to the center of the universe and reveled in his power. He was revered. He was revered by many, but there were some who refused. This drove him to a madness. He would rain down terror and destruction on those who would not revere him. I was free then. Free to come and go as I pleased, free to use my powers, free to change time and space. Then the spheres wrapped around me were soft and mutable. I could change whatever I wanted. It took him a while, but eventually Azathoth realized this. 100 years later, he would return to ask me another question. Who is the most powerful god, he asked. I am, I replied. I knew what he would do to me once he knew, but I couldn't lie. That was the one thing I wish I had, the power to lie. What powers do you have? The power to create, the power to destroy, the power to change time, the power to see the future, the power to change the future. Is there anything you can't do? He growled, looking more and more angry. I can't lie, I replied. Other than that, I don't know. He didn't like my answer. He and the other gods joined together and locked me into one dimension. That was when the spheres that make up who I am became fixed. They were no longer changeable. I was cursed to know everything, be everywhere at all times, and yet locked away from all at the same time. I was cursed to always be right. It was the first sin that he committed against me, and I have never forgiven him for it. 1,000 years would pass before he would come to me again with a question. Tell me, Yog-Sothoth, do you know how the universe will end? I smirked. Of course I do. He didn't ask me how. He just turned away and left. When Earth began to be populated by those who recognized us as gods, his visits became more frequent. He found that I was useful in leading the races of Earth to worship us. I was allowed to use my powers to lead. I caused destruction and death. I caused creation and life. I could influence all creatures on Earth, but only if the others wanted me to. And I was not allowed to touch the other gods. They were off limits to me. Any counsel I tried to give about where their paths were taking them was largely ignored. Only a few learned to listen. I had friends, enemies, lovers, and children, but there has only been one creature in this universe that I have cared about. The first time I noticed him, he was standing in our temple on Relia. He was the most faithful and powerful of our acolytes. He commanded a respect amongst the others that was a sight to behold. The skin of his body was a mottled green that shone and shimmered in the light. His head was smooth and hairless. On his back, he carried a pair of dragon wings that usually stayed folded up close to his body. The few times I saw him spread his wings were moments of great beauty. They were green and yet iridescent. He only took flight on particular full moon nights so that his wings glowed with the light. His eyes were pure black. Around his mouth were 8 tentacles, 4 above and 4 below. Most of the time they quietly slithered together, twisting, coiling, and uncoiling. When at prayer, the 4 on top would part to allow his voice to ring through the temple. When angered, they would coil tightly at the bottom like a small collection of fists. When in the throes of passion, they would wrap around his lover's neck. None of his lovers ever survived the first night with him, which was also why he had so few lovers. He was alone in the temple the first time I noticed him. He bowed before my altar and called out the most fervent prayer I had ever heard to that point. Mighty Yog-Sothoth, cut off from the world and yet a part of the world at all times, hear this lowly acolyte's prayer. Come to me. Tell me what to do. You I trust implicitly. You I trust with my mind, my body, my soul, my heart. Please, send me a sign. I can't tell you why it struck me so now. I had heard prayers lifted up to me before. I think I had even heard his. But as he knelt before my altar, calling out to me with every ounce of his being, I realized that this wasn't just the prayer of a faithful acolyte. This was the prayer of a lonely being who was in love. And the object of his affections, miraculously, was me. I've had few lovers. I knew none of them would be as devoted and faithful as Cthulhu, and knew that I was right. And somewhere in that moment I realized that I loved him. I had never hated being right more. Not because of him, but because of what happened later. It was only luck that at that moment a dimensional Shambler appeared, pulling along with him a Igloo. The poor thing was timid and afraid. I looked up from the viewing pool that I used to look at the scenes and orbs. What are you doing here? I called out. The Shambler turned and saw me. I knew him. He often slipped into my dimension to have a meal in peace and quiet. His name was Magnus. Like most dimensional Shamblers, he was covered from head to foot by a fine covering of reddish blonde hair, except on his face, the palms of his hands, and the soles of his feet. They all walked hunched over. When they ran, they used their fists to propel them along faster. Magnus wore the pelt of a bear that he had fashioned to a kind of tunic which hung down to his knees. Few see me as I truly am. When he turned, what he saw was a hooded figure sitting in the dark. What is it to you? Said Magnus with a smirk. I could use it, I said quietly. And you. Your reward would be great. He didn't believe me. Can't be anything better than a meal. I pushed back my hood and revealed the face of a young male antehuman. They came before you, and they were magnificent creatures to behold. Taller, stronger, infinitely more beautiful, wise beyond their young years, and capable of such great kindness and charity, so much greater than what you are now. If I miss any race, I miss the antehumans most of all. Magnus looked confused. How did you get here? What do you think I am? I said with a smirk. He knew then that I wasn't what I appeared. He knew where he was and who could be here, so I must be something else. Give me the Igloo. I have a task for him. The Igloo looked at me with trembling black eyes. His blue skin was a darker shade due to fear alone. Magnus shoved him towards me with a menacing growl. He didn't like it, but he wasn't sure what I was. I could be anything. I could tear him limb from limb if I wanted to. I reached out to the Igloo with a slow hand. What's your name? I asked him. Echo, he said quietly. Interesting name for a Igloo, I replied. They were gentle creatures of pure sound, tall and a deep, rich blue in color. They were often easy pickings for the more fierce creatures of the time. He was wrapped in an old, rough cloth around the waist, but that was all. I held out my hand to him. In it I was cradled in a glass orb. He knew who I was now, and so did Magnus. His limp, boneless fingers shook as he took the glass orb from me. Go to the temple. You'll find an acolyte there at prayer, I said to him. Crack open that orb when you meet him and let the sound inhabit you. Let my message come from you. As they were beings of pure sound, any message sent by them would arrive exactly as it had been stated by the sender of the message. I turned to Magnus. Send him back so that he's near the temple. Magnus grumbled, but did as he was told. He cut a slit in the air with his Shambler knife, and Echo landed near the steps of the temple. And what do I get for my troubles, he said, smoothing over the tear he had created. Oh, you can have him. I nodded towards an anti-human that was cowering in the corner. He'd been here for 3 days. Like many before him, he had thought he would be able to handle the knowledge I could bestow upon him, and just like the many before him, he couldn't. He had been cowering in the corner for the past several hours, trying to determine how many fireflies it would take to make a lantern to guide him out of the hell he was certain he was trapped in. At last count, he thought it would take 153, but he could only catch 152 of the imaginary fireflies he kept seeing flittering around him. I had grown tired of his babbling. Magnus now smiled at the idea of such a choice meal. Sigluos, I've been told, are fine in a pinch. They're a little tough and tasteless, but when one is hungry, one doesn't care. Antihumans, however, were always rich in flavor and nourishment. I turned back to the scene at hand while the antihuman screamed as he was eaten alive. Echo crept into the temple quietly, but Cthulhu knew he was there. He turned and stared at the blue creature before him. "What are you doing here?" he asked Echo. "You're far from home." Echo cracked open the sphere in his hands and absorbed the sound from it. "I have heard you, Cthulhu," he said in my voice, or at least my voice filtered through him so that it wouldn't cause the two of them to become insane. One has to be careful when your very words of tenderness and love can turn brains to mush. "You are in my favor. You are the only one in my favor. Pray to the gods, lead the others. Know that you are in my favor. Any who stand in your way will be struck down. Even if it is Azathoth, the idiot god, you will always be in my favor." Echo was smart. He reached forward and caressed Cthulhu's cheek. His slithering fingers briefly intertwined with the tentacles as his hand pulled away. Cthulhu shivered involuntarily, and it caused me to shiver as well. "Can you send a message back to her?" he asked. "I don't have the power to enter her dimension unless pulled there," Echo said sadly, shaking his head. He was correct. The only reason he got here was because of Magnus, who was currently licking the bones of the antihuman clean. But she is a part of all time and space. That was how she heard you, that she can hear you even now. Echo bowed and slowly shuffled away from the temple. Cthulhu stood in the very middle of the temple and turned his eyes heavenward. "I will remain faithful. I will never cause you to regret your faith in me." He never did. Even with all that happened, he never caused me to regret my faith in him.